The Kesh flagship Vanter's were dropped out of transit space 11,000 kilometers above Earth's moon, and for 8 full seconds, nothing happened. Ambassador Marshal Telovash counted those seconds. He always counted them. In 206 years of first contact work, the first response of a species facing an armed delegation told him everything he needed to know about how the negotiation would go. Frightened species scrambled fighters. Proud species broadcast defiance. Desperate species opened every channel at once, screaming for terms before anyone had even asked for anything. Humanity did none of these things. A single low-power hail arrived on a public frequency, spoken in accented but grammatically perfect Kesh trade tongue. Received. Hold position. A response is coming. Then silence, precise and unhurried, as if the most powerful fleet a Kesh envoy had assembled in a decade were an inconvenience to be scheduled around rather than a threat to be managed. Telovash did not like that silence. He had crossed 400 light-years to end it. The briefing packet on humanity was, by Kesh standards, embarrassingly thin. A single system. A single inhabited world. No colonies beyond their own moon and a scattering of orbital stations, though their sublight drones had reached 3 neighboring systems and returned with disquietingly detailed survey data. Population just under 9 billion. No unified government, or so the old intelligence said, except the old intelligence was 11 years stale, and the newer reports were contradictory in a way that made Telovash's analysts nervous. Humanity behaved in every recorded exchange with drone probes and listening posts, as though it were a single actor. Whether that was true or merely convenient theater, no one could say. What the Kesh wanted was simple, or so Telovash had been told to believe. 3 systems adjacent to human space sat inside a resource corridor the Kesh compact needed to resupply its Eastern War fleets. 2 were empty. The third held a scattering of human survey outposts, unmanned, easily relocated. The compact was not asking Earth to kneel. It was asking Earth to move some equipment and sign a corridor transit agreement, the same kind the compact had negotiated with 40 other species in the last century alone. In exchange, Earth would receive trade access, technology transfer, and formal recognition as a client species with protected borders. It was, Telovash thought, a generous opening position. He had seen species go to war over less and come out worse for it. He expected posturing, perhaps a counter-demand for a larger cut of the trade revenue, perhaps an insistence on inspecting Kesh warp technology before agreeing to anything. He expected, in short, a negotiation. What he got was a shuttle. It was unarmed, unescorted, and small enough that his sensor officer first mistook it for debris. It crossed the 11,000 kilometers to the Vanter's word at a leisurely, almost insulting pace, and requested docking clearance in the same clipped, correct Kesh that the original hail had used. 1 occupant, his tactical officer reported, voice tight with the particular unease of someone whose instruments were telling her something her training said was impossible. No weapon signature. No escort. No backup fleet within detectable range, sir. Nothing. It's like they sent us a mail courier. Let them dock, Telovash said, and did not let his own unease show. A species that sent a single unarmed envoy to meet an alien battle group was either supremely confident or supremely foolish, and he intended to find out which before the hour was out. Her name, she said, was Director Amara Voss, and she held no military rank, which Telovash noted with interest. She was small compared to the Kesh honor guard flanking the docking bay, dark-haired, unarmed, dressed in a plain gray suit with no visible insignia. She did not look up at the guards. She looked at him. Ambassador Marshal, she said, inclining her head exactly the correct 3 degrees that Kesh protocol required of an equal greeting an equal. Someone had briefed her well. Thank you for holding position. I understand you have a proposal. A generous one, Telovash said, and gestured her toward the negotiation chamber, a wide, warm-lit room designed over centuries to put newly contacted species at ease. It had worked on 40 client species. He watched Voss take in the room, the low seating, the deliberately non-threatening curve of the walls, and something in her expression suggested she recognized the design for what it was and was not particularly moved by it either way. He laid out the terms, as he had 100 times before: the corridor, the relocation of the outposts, the trade agreement, the protections. He kept his tone warm. He offered concessions before she could ask for them: a larger share of transit tariffs, a seat on the Regional Trade Council, technology sharing terms more generous than the Compact had ever extended a species this young. He was, by any reasonable measure, being extraordinarily kind. Voss listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and Telovash allowed himself to hope the silence meant she was weighing genuinely good terms. No, she said. Just that. No qualifier, no counteroffer, no request for time to consult a government. Telovash waited for the rest of the sentence. It did not come. I don't think you understood the offer, he said carefully. This is not a demand for surrender. We are proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement, one that dozens of species have accepted. I understood it, Voss said. The answer is no. We won't be moving the outposts, we won't be signing a corridor agreement, and we won't be entering negotiations on this matter at all, now or later. Then what? Telovash said, feeling the first true prickle of alarm he had felt in years. Would you like to negotiate instead? Nothing, Voss said. There's nothing to negotiate. I came to tell you that in person, because a message felt discourteous, given how far you've traveled. But there isn't a version of this conversation that ends differently, Ambassador Marshall, no matter how long we sit in this room. She stood, inclined her head the same precise 3 degrees, and asked to be returned to her shuttle. Telovash had negotiated with warlike species who postured before capitulating, with proud species who needed to save face before agreeing to nearly identical terms, with desperate species who took whatever was offered and thanked him for it. He had never, in 2 centuries, encountered a flat refusal, with no counterposition attached. Refusal was supposed to be an opening move. It was supposed to be followed by a demand, a threat, a delay tactic, something a skilled envoy could work with. Voss had given him nothing to work with, and that more than any fleet she might have hidden somewhere was what kept him standing at the observation window long after her shuttle had cleared the bay, watching it dwindle back toward the blue-white curve of Earth. He sent the transcript to the Compact's diplomatic corps with a flag for urgent review, expecting reassurance. What he got instead was silence for 6 hours, and then a response from a superior 3 ranks above him that read, in its entirety, *, do not escalate. Do not withdraw. Hold position and observe. Full council briefing pending, *. That was when Telovash understood that this was no longer only his problem. News of the refusal moved through Compact channels the way a spark moves through dry grass, invisibly at first, then all at once. It reached the trade guilds within a day, the client species councils within 2, and by the end of the week it had reached species who had no direct stake in the corridor dispute at all, but who understood, with the particular clarity of anyone who has ever built a career on reading rooms, that something fundamental had just changed in how the galaxy did business. The Compact's model of interstellar relations, refined over 3,000 years, rested on one assumption, so basic that no one had ever bothered to write it down as a rule. Every species negotiates. Even species preparing for war negotiated, because war was expensive and demands were cheap, and any rational actor preferred to get what it wanted through threats and concessions before it got what it wanted through casualties. Refusal to negotiate was not a strategy any economist or strategist in Compact space had a name for, because it had never needed one. It simply hadn't happened before, not with a species that had the technological capacity to make its refusal stick. And humanity, it turned out, had exactly that capacity. In the days after Voss's visit, Compact listening posts along the border began registering activity in human-adjacent space. Not fleet movements, not weapons tests, nothing that looked like preparation for war. What they registered instead was human ships, cargo haulers, survey craft, small unarmed vessels of every description, beginning to appear quietly and without announcement at points along the disputed corridor and well beyond it. Not blockading, not threatening, simply present, doing ordinary things, mapping, monitoring, occasionally waving on Kesh convoys that requested passage through routes humans had made no claim to. It was the most unsettling deployment Telovash had ever seen, precisely because it was not a deployment at all. There was no fleet to target, no command ship to threaten, no obvious point of leverage. There was just humanity, everywhere it chose to be, doing nothing anyone could object to and refusing, with total consistency, to discuss any arrangement that involved being somewhere else. "They're not massing for war," his tactical officer reported, for the fourth time that week, with the particular frustration of someone whose job depended on finding a pattern that refused to exist. "There's no logistics buildup, no weapon signature increase. If anything, sir, their military posture has gotten quieter since the refusal, not louder." "Then what are they doing?" Telovash asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer and did not like it. "Living their lives, sir, as far as I can tell." The council session that followed was the largest Telovash had ever been summoned to. Delegates from 40 client species crowded into a chamber built for half that number, the air thick with the competing atmospheric mixtures of a dozen worlds run through overlapping filtration fields. He gave his report. He answered questions for 3 hours. And underneath every question, he heard the same fear repeated in 40 different forms of phrasing. If humanity could refuse the compact and suffer no consequences, what stopped every other client species from doing the same? It was, Telovash reflected, the true source of the panic, more than any fear of human weapons. The compact's authority did not rest on being the strongest power in the galaxy, though it was that too. It rested on the shared, unspoken agreement of 40 species that negotiation, however unequal, was always better than the alternative, and that the alternative, refusal, carried consequences severe enough that no one tested it. Humanity had tested it, and so far nothing had happened to them at all. A delegate from the Andrei Trade Council, a species whose entire economy ran on tariffs extracted from exactly this kind of corridor agreement, stood and asked the question that would end up defining the rest of the crisis. "Ambassador Marshall, you met this Director Voss in person. Was she afraid?" Telovash considered the question carefully, because he understood it was really asking something else. Was humanity bluffing? Was there a fleet hiding somewhere that would materialize the moment the compact called their bluff? Was this refusal, underneath its calm surface, actually fear wearing the mask of confidence, the way so many young species postured before caving? "No," he said, "she was not afraid, and that troubles me more than if she had been." The compact's response, when it finally came, was not the show of force the war hawks on the council had demanded, nor the quiet capitulation the trade guilds, terrified of setting a precedent, had hoped might resolve the matter before anyone else noticed. It was instead an attempt to find the crack in the wall, a second envoy, a specialist this time, sent not to renegotiate the corridor, but to understand why an entire species had apparently agreed, without visible dissent, to say no and mean it absolutely. Her name was Senior Archivist Peu Rintal, and she did not come with warships or ultimatums. She came with questions, and she asked to speak not with a diplomat, but with a historian. Earth granted the request within a day, which surprised Telovash more than anything the compact fleet had observed so far. If humanity was hiding something, he thought it was not hiding it very hard. Rintal did not leave Bologna that evening. She stayed 3 more days, not because her orders required it, but because something in Marchetti's answer had lodged itself in her thinking and would not come loose. She spent the first day walking the city alone, watching humans go about ordinary business, buying bread, arguing over parking, laughing at things she could not understand, apparently untroubled by the fact that an alien war fleet sat in orbit above their world. She had expected fear somewhere beneath the surface, a controlled panic the population was simply better at hiding than most species managed. She found, instead, something closer to indifference, and the indifference disturbed her more than fear would have. On the second day, she asked Marchetti to introduce her to people who were not diplomats or historians, a shopkeeper, a schoolteacher, a man who repaired boats for a living. She asked each of them, through the translator, the same question. Did they know their planet had refused a compact ultimatum, and did they understand what refusing might cost them? The answers varied in wording, but not in substance. Yes, they knew. No, they were not especially afraid. One elderly woman, running a small shop that sold something Marchetti called espresso, put down the cup she was polishing, and looked at Ren-Tao for a long moment before answering. "My grandmother lived through an occupation," the woman said. "She used to say the worst thing you can do to people who might take everything from you is show them how much you're willing to give away first. I don't know your compact, dear, but I trust my government read the room the same way she would have." Ren-Tao wrote that down almost word for word, and it appeared, unattributed to any official source, near the end of her final report, not because it carried diplomatic weight, but because she could not shake the feeling that it explained more than anything Marchetti or Voss had told her directly. This was not a policy handed down from a distant government to a population that merely tolerated it. It was closer. In some ways she struggled to translate into Kesh political categories, to a shared instinct, held by shopkeepers and diplomats alike, that no single concession existed that a determined enough demand could not eventually turn into a habit. On the third day, before she returned to the shuttle that would carry her back to the fleet, Marchetti asked her a question of his own, the only one he had asked in 3 days of careful, patient answers. "What happens to a species in your compact," he said, "once it finally does say no, and means it? Not to you specifically. In general. Has anyone ever tried?" Ren-Tao opened her mouth to answer and found, to her own quiet unease, that she did not actually know. She had spent 2 centuries in the diplomatic corps of a compact that had absorbed 40 client species without a single one of them, as far as her own extensive archives recorded, ever refusing an opening demand outright and holding that refusal to its end. She had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that this was because the compact's terms were fundamentally reasonable, and that any species intelligent enough to reach the stars would eventually recognize as much. Sitting in Marchetti's paper-lined office, 400 light-years from the nearest compact world, she understood for the first time that she did not know whether that assumption had ever actually been tested, or whether it had simply never needed to be, because no one had ever been willing to find out. The historian's name was Professor Elias Marchetti, and he met Ren-Tao not in a warm-lit diplomatic chamber, but in an ordinary university office in a city called Bologna, walls lined with paper books that Ren-Tao found, to her private embarrassment, unexpectedly moving, a species that still kept its knowledge in physical form, page by fragile page, as if daring history to be forgotten. "You want to know why we won't negotiate?" Marchetti said, before she had finished her first careful question. "Everyone always wants to know that first. Let me show you something instead of telling you." He pulled up records on a screen, translated in advance into Kesh script with the careful, unhurried precision of someone who had clearly prepared for exactly this conversation. Ren-Tao read them in silence. A conference held nearly 200 years earlier, in a city called Munich, where the leaders of several human nations had agreed to hand over part of another nation's territory in exchange for a promise of peace. The promise had lasted less than a year. The war that followed had killed, by the ship's translation algorithm's careful estimate, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. "This is one example," Marchetti said. "There are others older and newer, across every culture that ever built an empire or fought a war. The pattern is always the same. Someone with power asks a smaller party to give up something reasonable to preserve peace. The smaller party agrees, because refusing looks like suicide and agreeing looks like survival. And then the appetite that made the demand in the first place doesn't stop, because it was never really about the thing that got handed over. It was about testing whether asking worked." "Your compact's corridor request is smaller than that," Ren-Tao said, though she heard, even as she said it, how thin the distinction sounded. "2 empty systems and some equipment." "I know," Marchetti said. "That's almost the point. If we negotiate on this, we're not negotiating about 2 empty systems. We're establishing that our answer to give us something reasonable or else is negotiable at all. Once that's established, the size of the ask only ever grows. We know that pattern too well to test it again, even at a scale this small, especially at a scale this small, because small asks are exactly how the pattern always begins." Ren-Tao sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way she might turn over an artifact whose function she did not yet understand. "So this isn't a negotiating position," she said slowly. It isn't leverage. You genuinely will not move, regardless of what is offered in exchange. That's right, even if the alternative is war. Marchetti's expression did not change, but something in his voice did, something quiet and old that made Rintal understand, for the first time, that she was not speaking to a diplomat performing resolve. She was speaking to someone who had simply already done the arithmetic long before she arrived, and did not need to do it again in front of her. Especially if the alternative is war, he said. We have never once, anywhere in our history, avoided a war by proving early that we could be talked out of a line we'd drawn. Every time we tried, the war came anyway, later and worse. So we stopped trying. It isn't bravery, archivist. It's arithmetic done a very long time ago that we've simply never had reason to redo. Word of the standoff reached the Andrai homeworld before the council session did, carried by traders who had no official standing but plenty of reason to talk. Second speaker Nomo Chiron heard it from her son first, over a private channel, before it reached her through any proper diplomatic route, and she remembered afterward that her first reaction had not been fear for Earth. It had been fear for the Andrai trade quotas. The Andrai had joined the compact 4 generations earlier, not through conquest, but through a corridor agreement almost identical to the one the Kesh had offered humanity. A modest concession, reasonable terms, protection in exchange for access. It had seemed, at the time, like a fair trade. It had been renegotiated 11 times since, each renegotiation slightly less generous than the last, each one justified by some new compact necessity that always seemed, in hindsight, to have been necessary indefinitely. Chiron had never once, in 30 years of trade service, heard anyone question whether the 11th renegotiation might simply be declined. It had not occurred to her that declining was a category of response available to a client species at all. She found herself, in the days after the news broke, doing something she had not done since she was young enough to still ask her tutors uncomfortable questions. She went back through the original corridor agreement, the one her grandparents had signed, and read the terms the Andrai had actually been promised, rather than the terms they had ended up living under. She did not raise the matter publicly. She was not certain, yet, that she wanted an answer badly enough to risk being the one who asked the question aloud in a chamber full of delegates whose livelihoods depended on nobody asking it. But she kept the original document open on her terminal for 3 days, and more than once she found herself simply looking at it, the way a person might look at an old photograph of themselves before they'd learned to make themselves smaller. She was not the only one. Compact Intelligence, in the weeks that followed, logged a quiet uptick in archival requests across a dozen client species, networks, old treaties, original terms, founding agreements pulled up and reread by people with no obvious professional reason to be reading them. Nothing so organized as unrest. Nothing that could be pointed to and named. Just a great many individuals on a great many worlds quietly checking what they had actually agreed to, as if for the first time in living memory it had occurred to them that the answer might matter again. Rintal's report reached the Compact Council 11 days after Telovash's, and it did something his had not managed to do. It ended the argument over whether humanity was bluffing. No fleet had appeared. No secret weapon had been unveiled. There was, as far as any compact intelligence source could determine, no hidden strength behind humanity's refusal at all beyond the ordinary defensive capacity of a single moderately advanced system, respectable, but nowhere close to a match for the compact's full military weight, if it ever came to that. Rintal's report made clear that this had never been the point. Humanity was not betting on winning a war. Humanity had simply decided, as a matter of settled collective conviction, that it would rather lose one than open the door that negotiation under threat represented. And it had made that decision with a completeness that no amount of pressure, veiled or otherwise, seemed able to touch. This was, Telovash understood, as the council chamber erupted into 40 overlapping arguments at once, the actual source of the panic rippling outward across the compact's client species. It was not fear that humanity would win a war against the compact. It was the much colder fear that humanity might simply be willing to lose one, and that no strategy the compact had ever developed, not force, not incentive, not patience, had an answer for an opponent who had removed capitulation from the list of available outcomes entirely. Every negotiating strategy the Compact had refined over 3,000 years assumed a floor beneath which any species would eventually agree to talk, if the alternative was made costly enough. Humanity, it seemed, had no floor. Or rather, they had one, and it sat so far below the Compact's opening demand that the demand itself had never come close to reaching it. The Warhawks argued for immediate, overwhelming force, before the precedent could spread further. The trade guilds argued that force would only prove humanity's point to every other client species watching, and that the real danger now was not Earth at all, but the 40 species who might soon start asking themselves whether they, too, had a floor they'd simply never tested. In the end, it was neither faction that decided the matter. It was Telovash himself, called to speak a final time before the council took its vote, who said the thing that no one else in the chamber seemed willing to say aloud. "We built our authority on being impossible to refuse," he said. "We have just discovered that we are not. The question in front of us isn't how to force humanity to negotiate. It's whether we can survive the fact that they won't, without discovering the same is true of everyone else in this room." The Compact did not go to war over the corridor. In the end, the Warhawks lost the vote by a narrow margin, not because the council found new sympathy for humanity, but because Rintal's report, quietly and devastatingly, had convinced enough delegates that a war fought to force capitulation from a species with no capitulation point would not look like any war the Compact had ever won. It would look like grinding attrition against an enemy who had already decided, before the first shot was fired, that losing was acceptable and yielding was not, and an enemy like that did not stop fighting when the numbers turned against it. It simply kept fighting, at whatever cost, for exactly as long as it took. The corridor agreement was quietly redrawn to route around human-claimed space entirely, at considerable extra cost to Compact logistics, filed in official records as a routine border accommodation rather than what every delegate in that chamber privately understood it to be. Telovash returned to Earth once more, this time without an honor guard, without a fleet at his back, without a single demand prepared. He met Voss again in the same room where she had first told him no, and this time he came only to ask a question of his own. "You never explained why," he said. "Not really. Your historian gave the archivist a lecture on your past. But I want to know what you thought would happen when you refused a fleet that outmasses your entire system by a factor you cannot have missed. What did you think we would do?" Voss considered the question with the same unhurried care she had given his original offer, weeks before. "Honestly, we didn't know," she said. "We weren't betting on you backing down. We were betting that it didn't matter whether you did." "That is not an answer that should have worked," Telovash said, and heard, for the first time in the entire affair, something almost like admiration in his own voice. "No," Voss agreed. "It shouldn't have. I imagine that's exactly why it did." He left without a treaty, without a concession, without anything he could report to the council as a victory of any conventional shape. What he carried back instead was smaller and heavier, the certain knowledge that somewhere among the Compact's 40 client species, others were watching what had just happened to Earth, and quietly, carefully, beginning to wonder whether they too had a line worth drawing all the way to the end. He did not know yet what that would cost the Compact in the years ahead. He suspected, standing on the observation deck, as the blue-white curve of Earth fell away behind him for the last time, that he was about to find out.